Did the city of Troy really exist? Is the Trojan War myth or military reality? And what about that giant horse? As the blockbuster Brad Pitt film Troy storms the cinemas, archaeologists and historians are shedding light on the ancient city and epic that inspired the movie. In the Greek sonnet, the Iliad, the reason for Troy, sovereign Paris of Troy takes the exquisite Helen of Greece from her significant other, ruler Menelaus. The demonstration carries the two countries to war, and in the long run Greeks drove by the fighter Achilles lay attack to Troy. The writer Homer presumably composed the legendary in the 8th or 10th hundred years before Christ, a few hundred years after the conflict should have occurred. Quite a bit of it is presumably dream. There is, for instance, no proof that Achilles or even Helen existed. In any case, most researchers concur that Troy itself was no fanciful Shangri-la, except for a genuine city, and that the Trojan conflict to be sure occurred. Archaeologists who have been diving into the fantasy of Homer's sonnet accept the incredible conflict might have been a cycle instead of a solitary occasion. The archaeological and text-based proof demonstrates that a Trojan conflict or wars occurred, and that Homer decided to expound on at least one of them by making it into an incredible 10-drawn-out adventure, said Eric Klein. Klein is a history specialist and classicist at the George Washington College in Washington, D.C. In northwestern Turkey, Heinrich Schliemann uncovered the site accepted to be Troy in 1870. Schliemann was a German swashbuckler and extortionist who assumed sole praise for the disclosure, despite the fact that he was digging at the site, called his Arlik, at the command of English classicist Plain Calvert. The site contains 9 urban areas based on top of one another. There is a fortification in the center and a town around it. A high wall invigorated the town. Anxious to find the amazing fortunes of Troy, Schliemann shot his direction down to the subsequent city, where he found what he accepted were the gems that once had a place with Helen. For reasons unknown, the gems were 1,000 years more established than the time portrayed in Homer's epic. Today archaeologists accept that the 6th and 7th most established urban communities found in layers at Hizarlik are the best contender for the Troy of the Iliad. Radiant and solid, city number 6 seems to be Homer's Troy. The issue is that this city's obliteration in 1250 before Christ doesn't seem to have been brought about by war, however, a seismic tremor. In any case, Homer's story might give some insight. In the Iliad, the Greeks breached the city walls by hiding inside a giant horse, which they present as a gift to the Trojans. The Trojan horse could have been a metaphor for Poseidon, a god associated with horses who was both the god of the seas and earthquakes. The suggestion is that Homer knew that the city he was describing had been destroyed by an earthquake, Klein said. But that's not how you want to end your monumental saga, with a whimper. So he concocted this idea of a Trojan horse. The 7th oldest city at the site, on the other hand, fits the description of a city under siege and destroyed by war in 1175 before Christ. Archaeologists have found arrowheads in the streets. But the city itself was not as grand as the one described by Homer. Homer may have taken the description of Troy 6 and the destruction of Troy 7 and, using poetic license, blurred the two into one 10-year-long war, Klein said. In the late Bronze Age, Troy, if located at the Hizarlik site, would have been a great prize for power-hungry kings. Perched at the entrance to the Black Sea, the city would have been at an international crossroads. The Greek Mycenaean Empire would have lain to the west. The Hittite Empire, which stretched from Mesopotamia to Syria, would have been to the east. As for its great wealth, Troy may have acquired that by taxing seafarers traveling into the Black Sea. It would have been a great plum for the Mycenaeans to capture, Klein said. This war may have been fought for the usual reasons: economic gain, greed, glory, territory, and the control of trade routes. One theory suggests that the lesser-known Sea Peoples wrecked Troy. Originally from what is now Italy, the Sea Peoples swept across the Mediterranean Sea from west to east. According to inscriptions found in Egypt, this group came through Troy at the time of the Trojan War, around 1200 before Christ. Yet another theory, supported by ancient Hittite texts, suggests an intermittent, 200-year conflict that raged between the Hittite Empire and a rebel coalition that included Troy. In this text, the Mycenaeans of Greece actually allied themselves with the Trojans against the Hittites. Archaeologists have found Mycenaean pottery in Troy 6, supporting the suggestion that the two nations were allies. However, there is a historical precedent for a war being fought over an injustice done to a king. In the 14th century before Christ, the Hittite king received a letter from the Egyptian queen. She said her husband had died and asked the Hittite king if he could send a son for her to marry. The Hittite eventually agreed and sent one of his sons. On his way to Egypt, however, the prince was killed. Believing the Egyptians killed him, the Hittites declared war on Egypt. If the Hittites and the Egyptians could go to war in the 14th century over the son of the king, why wouldn't the Mycenaeans and Trojans go to war less than 100 years later because the king's wife has been kidnapped? Klein asked. One can't really rule out that it was fought over Helen, but at the moment we don't have any supporting data for that. One thing is clear, the war seemed to have ended in age. Homer is writing a memory of the end of the world, said Diane Thompson, author of the Trojan War, Literature and Legend from the Bronze Age to the Present. Nostalgia fuels his writing, and it has fueled it ever since. When the Roman poet Virgil in the 1st century before Christ rewrote Homer's story in his own classic the Aeneid, he turned the Greeks into scruffy villains and described the Trojans as beautiful losers who went on to found the Roman Empire. Through the ages, European people clung to this version, many of them tracing their ancestry back to Troy. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.